Well, welcome to the podcast, everyone. I'm Marcy Markusa, and I always begin the pod by telling you that the purpose of being here is to make sense of our world and our nation, but through the lens of Manitoba. And we have been talking about tariffs on the podcast for days, but now things are getting serious. This is Manitoba. So what do I mean by that? Well, you likely know. February 4th is the date when U.S. President Donald Trump's 25% tariff on Canadian goods and 10% tariffs on energy imports will begin. And you have been writing to us here at CBC Manitoba with your concerns, with your questions, with your points of view. Some of them are about how you're changing shopping habits already, looking at the labels. Some of them are deeper concerns about will you have a job? Some small business owners saying, big part of my business is the States. What does that mean? So we still have probably more questions than answers, but we certainly have some solid analysis for you today. So let's begin with the first interview. You're going to hear 3 on the podcast today. The first conversation is with Duane Bratt. He is setting out the lay of the land and also looking at whether or not a bailout package might be something possible for Canadian businesses should you find yourself in that situation. He is a professor of political science at Mount Royal University. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Marcy.
So I want to move right to the political response. The PM gave a speech Saturday. Let's start with him. I have a lot of people that were praising what he had to say. What did you make of his tone, and what would you say, who was his message for?
I would praise him as well. I thought it was a very strong speech, and it was very measured. It was firm. It was resolute. He laid out clearly the actions that Canada is going to take. As far as the audience was concerned, I think some of it was the Canadian audience to show what our response is, but a lot of it was aimed at the Americans, not at the U.S. government. It was aimed at the American people, and he took pains to walk through a lot of the political and military partnership over the years, from fighting together in World War I and World War II and Korea and Afghanistan, to helping the U.S. after 9/11 when they diverted flights to Canada, most notably in Gander, Newfoundland, to sending firefighters to California just last week. So it was distinguishing between the Trump administration and the American people. He let Canada know that we were going to face pain. He let the Americans know that they were going to face pain as well. He didn't demonize the U.S. He did not demonize the American government as much as he may have wanted to. So it was firm, it was resolute, it was measured, and it wasn't just in the statement. It was in the question and answers as well.
May I ask you what you think of that strategy, the specific strategy, not of the tone of this, but of also speaking to the American people, almost like, hang on a moment here, let's talk about our relationship between the two countries.
I think that's the best strategy. We're using every lever that we can. It's tough to use logic and reason with Donald Trump because this is unreasonable and irrational. What will change his mind, what will cause a reversal in policy, is the effect that this is going to have on the American people when they realize that the price of gas is going to go up and the price of vegetables is going to go up and the price of all toilet paper is going to go up. When job losses start to occur, make it clear who is responsible for this, and that is Donald Trump.
If I may interject there, because it's interesting what you're saying. What may change his mind, because of course, if he feels like this is short-term gain for a longer-term, stronger America, where he has other, negotiates in this way to try to bring manufacturing back, for just one example, to the main floor of the towns and cities across America. He sees this as a long game way to do that. That's of course, the big question. I want to know what you think of the comments I read.
Well, and that is assuming that is the long strategy here, that this is about manufacturing jobs. The statement was about fentanyl, but that is a legal pretext. This is not about border security. He's also talked about how the Americans subsidize Canada and how this will make the Americans rich because tariffs go into the treasury, not knowing that American people pay this. Or is this about annexing Canada? Is this because Canada has treated the U.S. horribly over the years? Like, the rationale keeps changing over and over again, which makes it very difficult in how to respond.
You're,
I'd be
you're,
very curious to see what message Trudeau will give when he actually talks to Trump today.
You're absolutely right to point out that moving target of motivation for this. Let's get to what we heard so far from other leaders. So Pierre Poilievre spoke this weekend as well. I did see his message, but for those that missed it, can you say what he said, the Conservative leader?
Yeah, basically reiterating what Trudeau said, that we need to retaliate. He even praised Trudeau at times. He did call for the recall of Parliament. Now, he says that is to provide a unified front against the United States, but he didn't like prorogation at all. And I wonder if why he wants to recall Parliament is to bring down the government. He's been unclear on that. Bear in mind, in the middle of this international crisis, we're in the middle of a domestic political vacuum. Prime Minister Trudeau announced his intent to resign a month ago, but a new Liberal leader won't be chosen for another month. We're currently prorogued. There will likely be an election in April, but Poilievre wants an election now. Doug Ford in Ontario called an election to deal with Donald Trump. So we've got some domestic political issues going on at the same time that we have this international crisis. But so far, the messaging has all been the same towards the U.S.
How important is that? I mean, I think the average Canadian might have breathed out when they saw all of the leaders coming to their various microphones and kind of being on that same strong Canadian page. But how important is that in your view?
I think that is important. Even Danielle Smith, who refused to sign on to a previous statement, did acknowledge on the weekend that this is due to Donald Trump. It's the first time I've heard her publicly criticize Donald Trump. Now, she's not fully on board. Maybe she's got one foot in the Team Canada approach, because the rest of her letter or op-ed in the National Post was about we need to de-escalate the rhetoric, we need to use diplomacy, which was an implicit criticism, retaliation, and that the solution is to build more pipelines across the country. In other words, all of her pet projects are now the best way of dealing with Trump. But she is much closer to Team Canada than she was in the past. But everybody else, I think, has really taken a prominent stance. Now, some of it is simply symbolic. Removing alcohol, Kentucky bourbon, California Cabernet off of our shelves may make us feel good, but it's a small drop in the bucket to the hundreds of billions of dollars of trade between the two countries. Booing the American national anthem may make us feel good.
Yeah, I saw that at some of the hockey games, yeah.
Yeah, trying to buy Canadian goods at the grocery store. Sure, when it comes to coffee or breakfast cereal or potato chips, but try to find lettuce and fruits and vegetables. And many of the products, we don't even know where the rules of origin kick in. This is going to cause a lot of pain starting tomorrow. Hundreds of thousands of people are going to lose their jobs in the next 2 weeks in Canada and the U.S. You're going to push Canada into a recession, the U.S. possibly into a recession, and this never had to occur. This is incredible pain on both sides of the border. The most serious economic crisis since the Great Depression, the worst Canada-U.S. relationship since prior to World War I, yep. And it's due to one man and the person and the people behind him.
Thank you very much, Duane, for setting us up to cover obviously this historic moment in our country and in North America. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Marcy.
That's Duane Bratt, professor of political science at Mount Royal University, painting quite a serious view of whether or not bailouts will be coming for Canadian businesses. And as he outlined, what will be weighed as the federal government may consider potential bailouts as well. So as this trade battle with the U.S. is underway, one of the things that we wanted to revisit on the podcast today was part of what Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had to say. And this is about how Canada would hit back. So obviously those counter tariffs you're hearing about, this is some of what Justin Trudeau had to say.
Canada will be responding to the U.S. trade action with 25% tariffs against $155 billion worth of American goods. And as part of our response, we are considering, with the provinces and territories, several non-tariff measures, including some relating to critical minerals, energy, procurement, and other partnerships.
So Canada's response is in 2 stages. Tomorrow, there will be tariffs against $30 billion worth of American products. You can find the list online at cbc.ca. And then in 3 weeks, more tariffs on $125 billion worth of goods. We're going to talk about what the economic impact will mean in a moment, but let's get back to your comments because you've been weighing in like crazy. There's hundreds of them from Manitoba on my Facebook page. I asked over the weekend as this was all developing. This one's really interesting because this comment comes from Jim Rondo, who was 17 years in NDP MLA in this province and had helped ministerial portfolios for industry, economic development and mines, as well as he was Minister of Science, Energy, Tech and Mines as well. And he was a MLA, as we mentioned, for 17 years. So Jim Rondo said we need to expand our markets. We also need to have the euro become the common currency of exchange versus the U.S. dollar. And finally, we need to identify the 5 or 6 critical minerals that we ship to the USA and stop this. We can pay the companies for the minerals and just keep them in storage. Finally, we need to establish an export tariff on electricity and gas and oil. So that coming from Jim Rondo with, of course, a differently informed opinion than others might have. Rick Fikes weighing in, there's no good solution. But the theory is that some form of answer is required and cutting off imports would trigger a war. So this is the median approach. Well, as I mentioned, let's talk about the economic impact here. We have Fen Hampson with us via Zoom, Professor of International Affairs at Carleton University and co-chair of the high-level expert group on Canada-U.S. relations. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Good to be with you, Marcy.
Thank you so much for being here. You heard me mentioning some of the comments coming in, including from former MLA here, long time in Manitoba, who was in charge of industry. Is there any way, I want to start with this, is there any way at this point to predict, job losses that are possible in this country because of this?
Well, there have been a number of studies that have been done by Canadian economists, by American economists, and those estimates, and it's all kind of contingent on, how long does the tariff war last, right? So if it's going into weeks and months, we could expect to see something like 600,000 fewer jobs, which will push unemployment up to 10% or higher. Right now, it's around 6%. So that's a pretty sizable increase in unemployment. It will be felt most acutely in those sectors of the economy that do a lot of business with the United States. Automobile sector, parts and assembly, I think they're going to take a real hit. That's largely based in Ontario. Energy sector, less so, for the following reason that, yes, there's a 10% tariff there on energy exports, but the producers that we sell our oil and gas to in the United States can't substitute it with oil from pretty much anywhere else. It's heavy oil, and those pipelines are already in place. There isn't infrastructure to bring it from somewhere else. So they're kind of stuck buying it at a higher price, and the question is, who pays the 10%? Do we get stuck with the bill, or does the purchaser get stuck with the bill, as say the refineries in Texas and Louisiana?
In terms of, I'm just going to interject because you brought up the who gets stuck with the bill question. I want to read you a comment that a longtime business owner here in Manitoba wrote in, and I want to see what your sense is of this as we look at how the feds have responded. Here, Rick Koss wrote in, I would like to see a commitment from Ottawa to use all or most of the tariffs collected to support the many businesses that will be severely impacted by the trade war, similar to the COVID supports, but in this case, the money wouldn't come from our pockets, but those of the companies exporting into Canada. Individual consumers will be impacted, but not to the same degree. We have choices to buy alternates or not buy at all, but businesses whose markets are primarily in the U.S., United States, don't have the same options. What is your thought of that? Some kind of a response from Ottawa to kind of support businesses through this time? Do you think that's likely?
Well, there were meetings on the weekend by our government officials to do just that. We obviously have the experience from COVID of providing, various forms of grants and loans. But I think, the real question is going to be, if this is going to be a long tariff war, and those tariffs don't come off right anytime soon. Providing support to businesses that are no longer viable is, not a very attractive option, to be blunt, because you can write them a check, but if they're going to go out of business anyway, that's not money well spent, right? And that also applies to a loan you might give them. To be sure, you want to help the workers in those firms, and we do have unemployment insurance. I mean, those are mechanisms that are already in place. I think there's also a lot of concern based on the COVID experience. We're already hearing it, that if the feds start shoving money out the door and not doing it very carefully, there are going to be abuses of the system. People are going to game the system. So, how do you manage it in a way that the money is spent where it needs to be spent? But that's going to be a tricky one, and it's all kind of contingent on where's this going, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think our smaller firms are much more vulnerable than our big firms in the energy sector or the automobile sector. They can absorb the shock, but if you're a small company that's making fences that you sell in the United States, or roofing materials, and you have 100 employees and 80% of your business is on the other side of the border, you're in big trouble.
We have the Manitoba Chamber on to walk us through some of those local concerns a little bit later in the program. Fen, obviously won't be the last time we're speaking. Thank you very much for your time this morning and being on our program here.
My pleasure.
That's Fen Hampson, a professor of international affairs at Carleton University and co-chair of the high-level expert group on Canada-U.S. relations. You're listening to the podcast, This is Manitoba. I'm Marcy Markusa. Well, let's turn to specifically what people in Manitoba are saying about the situation now, beyond, as you heard, some of the comments that you've been writing to us about. We've heard from a number of different people. The Chamber of Commerce president for Manitoba Chambers is going to be with us in the podcast in a moment with his analysis to talk about how we move forward from here. Also to talk a little bit about specifically a manufacturing plant in Provincial Prairie and how it could be affected by these potential tariffs here. But first, let's hear from the Premier of Manitoba. The Premier of Manitoba, Wab Kinew, announced that Manitoba Liquor and Lotteries Corporation will stop selling products imported from the States. That starts February 4th. LCs are going to pull American products off the shelf. They will also stop ordering American goods. So how will that affect the American economy? Here is more of what Premier Wab Kinew had to say.
We have to stand up for jobs in our province. We have to stand up for manufacturers and the ag industry and the energy industry and everyone else who's going to be threatened by these tariffs. And it's very, very important that we stand up for ourselves, not just as Manitobans, but also as Canadians. The idea of one Manitoba takes on renewed importance. As we head into this period of tariffs, some of our fellow Manitobans are going to feel the impacts right away. For other Manitobans and in other industries, it may take some time, but we all need to stand together, shoulder to shoulder, to be there for one another. The situation that we're confronted with, yes, this is a trade dispute. This is an economic threat. But we should also be very, very clear-eyed about the threat that this poses to our sovereignty as an independent country.
So that was our Premier Wab Kinew speaking yesterday about the imposed 25% tariff on Canadian goods. It kicks in tomorrow. Donald Trump has also announced that there will be a lower tariff on energy at 10%. Chuck, what are you hearing from businesses in our province from over the weekend?
Well, obviously there's concern about this in terms of what the impacts are going to be, when it's going to be felt. The fact that we're continuing to go down that path makes no sense to anyone. Again, we're even hearing the same from the other side of the border. When you talk to organizations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and manufacturing organizations who are also opposed to this tariff war that we're going through because of the relationship we've had the long-standing relationship and the trade relationship we've had between the two countries for as long as we have, and the fact that we have a free trade agreement that's already in place, that's working well, that's benefiting both sides of the border. All we're seeing is this is a lose-lose for Canada and for the United States. And there's just this uncertainty as to why we're going down this path.
Listeners are writing to us, one of them from Steinbach, saying, they work for window manufacturer. They're worried. Obviously, we've heard from those in the pharmaceutical businesses and the ag businesses that have spoken to CBC about their concerns. What businesses, either big or small, or industries are you watching across Manitoba or hearing from that are kind of the top of the list for concern?
And again, it's going to be those. It's going to be a lot of manufacturing companies. It's going to be a lot in the ag industry as well. Organizations like pork producers that export close to 90% of their goods south of the border or to other jurisdictions. These are ones that there's concern with this tariff coming in place in terms of what that's going to mean, because it's not as simple as just sort of deciding that, okay, we're not going to do business with the U.S. anymore. You have to have, and from these U.S. consumers, they're going to have other companies or countries that they're going to deal with to make up the difference. And if they can't, then they're going to continue to rely on those relationships. And that's going to be dependent on, who's going to end up paying for those tariffs. Is it going to be, obviously, it's going to be the U.S. consumers, but at the same time, they're going to be looking for reductions and making sure that those relationships continue with Canadian businesses. So this is where the next couple of months are going to be extremely interesting. And I think it's important. And I think one of the things that, President Trump has done is he's really woken up Manitoba and Canadian governments in terms of, okay, we need to be united. We need to make sure that we've got a consistent message, and we need to focus on growing our own economy. And that's a strong message that the business community is sending as well, is that we need to focus on that.
Okay, so I need to read a couple of things to you that have been developing this morning. So I know that you had said that you hope it doesn't get to the point Canada needs a bailout. We had a listener write in, Rick Koss, who is a longtime business owner here, who said he wants to see a commitment from Ottawa to use all or most of the tariffs collected to support the many businesses that will be severely impacted in the trade war. So he's saying we should be thinking about a bailout. But when I posed that question this morning to Duane Bratt, who's professor of political science at Mount Royal University, and he's works specifically in U.S.-Canada relations, and I talked about the idea of a bailout. He actually, this is going to sound very, very harsh, but he said, effectively, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said that to spend the money on bailout packages quickly without thinking this through could be a waste of money, because the sad reality in his view is that these tariffs could shut down businesses that won't make comebacks. So you have to think very carefully about bailout packages. What's your view on on bailouts this morning?
Yeah, and I think I agree to a certain extent. I think there does need to be some supports in the short term, but I think in the longer term, this is the real opportunity to, where do we focus on how do we grow our economy? And so there's some certain things that we can look at. We can look at reducing internal trade barriers. So these are things that we can control ourselves, and where we're making some of those key investments as well is on infrastructure. So it's not simply about, bailing out businesses and to his point, that may not be profitable in the long run. It's how do we make key investments to make sure that the impact of these trade barriers are going to be less impactful? How can we find new targets? How can we move forward with products? How can we be more profitable here in Canada?
So how poised is Manitoba to do that? Do you believe that we've had a strong enough, economic view in terms of, I should say, investment, development, pivoting? We've always had a diversified economy, but how quickly can Manitoba actually change if someone's saying, wow, my business right now is not going to be viable if I lose the States?
It is going to, there's no question, it is going to take time, which is why you are going to have some supports in place to help these businesses in the meantime. But at the same time is focusing on what are the different things that we can control. Where do we need to make key investments, whether it be in infrastructure, whether it be in workforce training? How do we support some of these businesses so that they can kind of get through this? Whether it's looking at additional markets, that's going to be a key component of this as well. And continuing to have those conversations south of the border. Like, as I mentioned, that we're hearing time and time again, whether it's even Republican members are not necessarily all in favor of going down this path because they also recognize the negative implications that they're going to have on U.S. consumers as a result of this. So it's continuing to have that dialogue in these challenging times, but also looking at things that we can control ourselves and trying to drive our own economy at the same time.
We've got a question that came in, actually, and I just want to play it. This came off the listener line, Chuck. So let's have a listen because a lot of Manitobans have more questions than answers this morning, but this one has to do with Portage la Prairie.
Good morning. This is Liz from near Portage la Prairie, and I'm wondering something. I was driving by the Simplot plant just outside of Portage the other night, and I was wondering, it's more a question of how it's going to work on a company like Simplot, which is owned by Americans. It's stocked with Canadian potatoes for the most part, mostly from Manitoba here. Although every once in a while, if there's a shortage, they go down to North Dakota and bring up some potatoes to keep Simplot's plant production going. And then apparently the potatoes that are processed there are turned into French fries for the American market and shipped back down to be distributed, from here to Chicago and beyond. So how is that going to work with the tariff?
Can you answer that, Chuck, or are those some of the conversations you're having with...
But that's exactly the point. That just shows how intertwined our relationship with the U.S. is, because your caller's absolutely right, that those potatoes that are being grown in Manitoba, processed at Simplot, are typically going to the south of the border into the United States. So those United States companies would be paying the tariff on that as well. So what are the other options? Does Simplot look in terms of how do we make sure that what we're processing here in Canada stays in Canada? Again, those are some of the challenging times and why a lot of companies are concerned about this at the end of the day, because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because we've had this relationship for as long as we have that has worked well. Putting these tariffs in place, which is why I say again, it's a lose-lose. It's a lose on both sides of the border and makes no sense in terms of how we go forward with this.
All right, Chuck. I mean, frankly, we could talk every day because we don't know where the story is going to be going. But thank you very much for being here this Monday morning. Thank you.
Always a pleasure, Marcy.
Chuck Davidson is the president and CEO of the Manitoba Chambers of Commerce. Well, I'm not sure if we didn't raise more questions than we answered today, but that is the state of what's going on right now with this trade war and tariffs. So we hope you join us again in another edition of This is Manitoba. I'm Marcy Markusa. Don't forget to like and share.